I'm just now realizing, for those who are probably watching the video version of this, the color of the book is almost identical to the color of my walls. And so having it sit upright, there's no cover illustrations or anything. So it just is a solid green. So it just sort of looks, it blends in with the background, I'm realizing now. Hey there, bibliophiles. Welcome to another episode of From the Archives, a short book review podcast where I talk about a book from my library and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. Every episode, I ask myself the following questions about the book or books that I am reviewing. Who wrote it? What's it about? What are other people saying about it? And should you read it? And then the last thing I ask myself is, should I can it or keep it? Shelve it or shove it? Chuck it or cherish it? Reread or recycle? Or jettison or set it in? Those are all the fun ways to say, should I keep it on my bookshelf? Why or why not, basically. With all that being said, let's get into this week's book. Luckily, we are moving away from Intro to Anthropology and Archaeology textbooks. I'm sure some of you probably were thinking, oh, this isn't my bag, this isn't my wheelhouse. You know, it's a lot of anthropology and archaeology stuff, but I wasn't expecting an entire episode reviewing Intro to Anthropology and Archaeology textbooks. But not so. This week, the book I'm talking about is The Viking World by Jacquelin Simpson. It's a rather thin, I wouldn't quite call it a coffee table book because it's about just slightly smaller than the size of a piece of regular letterhead, I think is 8.5 by 11 inches in the United States. It's slightly smaller than that. But it's 192 pages, lots of pretty illustrations in it. I would almost say it's like a coffee table book, but it definitely has a lot of text in it for a coffee table book. So it's, I don't know where I'd place it. It's also, at least the copy I have, I feel like it had a book jacket at some point. But the version I have is just a hardback, just plain green cover, no pretty cover design or anything like that. So I suspect at one point it had a cover jacket, but it has since been lost. This was originally published in 1980, and to give you a little context about the author, I did a little bit of research on her, Jacquelin Simpson, and essentially it explains a lot about the book. Knowing a little bit more about Jacquelin Simpson. So she got her bachelor's degree, as far as I can tell. This is mostly just straight from her wiki. I didn't know much about her. She's not like a lot of the books that I review on here end up being either famous authors or like professors that you could like look up and see where their academic affiliations lie. But with Jacquelin Simpson, she is an English literature and medieval Icelandic expert. Or at least that's what she studied at Bedford College, University of London. And so she's spent a lot of time researching specifically Icelandic folklore. So it makes a lot of sense that there's a lot of folklore and stories about the Icelandic sagas in this book. But we'll get into that in a moment. The fun thing I learned about Jacquelin is that she became sort of a collaborator and close sort of, I guess you could say, expert with Terry Pratchett. Because Terry Pratchett writes a lot of fantasy, a lot of sort of, I guess, high fantasy, what you would say. Writes a lot about, ancient mythology-based stuff. I think it was either him or it was, who's the other guy he's collaborated with? I know I have one of his other books. Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. Sorry, I had to look up at the book that I have on the wall, and it's a bit far away, so I couldn't read it. Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, who wrote Good Omens. I believe the two of them collaborated on American Gods, or maybe it was one or the other. But, you get the idea. They do a lot of mythology, so it makes sense that he would want to collaborate with Jacquelin Simpson, because she's probably going to give him a lot of good stories, Norse mythology, all that kind of good stuff. But what's funny is the story of how they met was at a book signing in 1997. At least, I'm taking it on faith. This story just sounds too fun and too cute to not believe. But Pratchett was being, I guess you could say, crass. I mean, maybe not crass, but he was asking everyone for their best magpie rhymes that they knew. And this, I guess, magpie, not knowing much about it, there's the theme from the TV show Magpie, but it also comes from ancient mythology or ancient folklore. And so when Jacquelin Simpson got to her point in the line, she gave a very academic answer of, well, there's actually 19 or so, but then you start getting into quibbles and, then do you want to actually know? It's sort of like the scene in Groundhog Day when Phil Connors is asked, did you actually want to talk about the weather, or were you just making chit chat? I can just imagine that's kind of how this scene played out. Was sort of she gives a very academic answer, and Terry Pratchett's like, oh, this person knows, which led to a collaboration, I guess, on future books and future research. But that's just a little bit about Jacquelin Simpson. So the book itself is broken up into several chapters about Viking life. The first one is Ruffians or Heroes. I mean, it basically breaks down, it's sort of read like not really an ethnography, because some of the ethnographies that I've read for this podcast are structured very differently. And obviously this is about people from the 800s and 900s, so can't exactly interview them. But, you've got Ruffians or Heroes, the expansion of the Vikings, life on the land, ships and seafaring, merchants, weapons, family and society, games, art, poetry, and religious practice and funerary rites. So all the kind of standard stuff you would encounter in a book about a specific culture, and it reads super easy. I mean, I have read a lot of books for this podcast, and this one felt super easy to read. Not to say that the other ones haven't been super easy to read, but I mean, compared to the most recent books that I've had to read, like Intro to Anthropology and Archaeology textbooks, it was really refreshing, and it kind of showed my lack of knowledge in Viking archaeology. I mean, not that I should have been an expert or anything, but I knew, vaguely, like, 800s, 900s. I knew Iceland. I knew Eric the Red. I knew Leif Erikson. I knew Vinland was the fancy name for North America. Lonzo Meadow, the famous archaeological site in Newfoundland, that the Viking settlement there. And, I knew some broad brushstroke stuff. But this gives you, I think, honestly, if you are vaguely interested in like getting into the nitty gritty of Viking details, this will actually give you more than I think you would want, but it's still in an interesting enough way. I am not by any means a textiles person. For example, I'm not a textiles person. When doing archaeology, it's usually, I vaguely kind of get interested in textiles, but you start talking about loom weights and you start talking about weave and weft and, how to get, not fur, wool and turn it into yarn. That's not really something I'm super interested in, but I thought Simpson did it justice in the section talking about how important wool was to the Icelandic economy, and it really makes sense now because I didn't research her background until after I finished reading the book. I was like, there is an oddly large amount of context about Iceland. It's very Iceland-centric, the Viking world. And there's a lot about England, and I didn't know a lot of this history, and I feel like I'm better off for it. I probably know enough to be dangerous now, and obviously this is from 1980, so this is 41 years old. Jeez. It was very Icelandic-centric, and I knew a little bit about Iceland, and I knew like this was a location that people migrated to, but I had always understood Iceland in the context of Viking lore. I'd always understood it as sort of a exile location. I always thought Iceland was bad marketing. Like my understanding of a lot of Viking history boiled down to marketing 101. So Iceland was where people got banished to, so that's why they called it Iceland, even though it ended up being a really nice place to live. And then Greenland was a marketing ploy of, Greenland's actually covered in ice, but we want to, pitch it to people like, hey, move to Greenland, it's green. And that's basically my understanding of Viking history. But actually, I learned a lot about how that's not true at all, and how there's conflicting accounts about the origin of the name Iceland and of the founding of Vinland, which is North America. So we usually credit Leif Erikson, but apparently there's this other guy whose name is escaping me, but shame on me, right, for not remembering. There's only so many Norse names I can remember in my head, and Leif and Eric are easy enough because those are the two that I've heard I actually have met people named Leif and Eric, myself included. So so it seems logical that I would remember those names over like Although there are some fun names they had in there, like Snorri. Like, talk about a fun name. So there's a lot about Iceland that I was not expecting to learn, and it put Iceland on the map for me. Like, Iceland's one of those places like, yeah, it's cool. It counts as Europe in my mind, like, technically. But, the amount of history talking about how important Iceland was to the Viking Age, and basically how it wasn't very violent in its takeover. The colonization of the rest of Europe obviously involved violence, raids, pillaging, the classic standard stuff that you hear about. But with Iceland, it sounded almost, I don't know, too good to be true, romanticized perhaps, because a lot of the discussion, especially the subsistence stuff, talks about how people had large tracts of land. There wasn't a lot of urbanization in Iceland. Interesting to think about how people had access to certain resources because of the wind on Iceland. There wasn't a whole lot of natural wood to exploit, so you depended on driftwood. So it was actually kind of interesting, at least from my perspective. Maybe other people might have a very different perspective. As someone who does a lot of studies of hunter-gatherers, it was kind of interesting to start reading about Vikings having to do the same kind of decision-making and diet breadth, as we would say in hunter-gatherer studies, as a lot of hunter-gatherers, talking about certain months being, I think they said May was like the egg month, because not because they harvested eggs from chickens, but because of the millions of birds on Iceland. You could literally just go out and harvest them like a wild resource, or harvesting driftwood, or collecting peat, or how to raise hay. I assumed in my mind that Iceland was not this cozy place to grow a lot of crops, and so that basically checked out. You could grow barley, wheat, a couple of other cereals, but a lot of things you couldn't grow on Iceland. So they depended on basically animal husbandry to survive on Iceland. And, it's not a vegetarian's paradise in Iceland is what I learned. If you refuse to eat meat, you were going to have a rough go of it on Iceland. But they did eat a lot of dairy. So yeah, I guess it was very Iceland centric is what I'm getting at here. A lot more surprising than I expected to be Iceland centric. Now, I do have other books about the Vikings in my library. This one right here by Johannes Bronsted. I probably butchered that. A Pelican original. I haven't read this one yet, but I have to imagine, I'm actually pulling this out for the first time for this episode. I thought about reading the Viking World and the Vikings side by side, but just due to time constraints, I just couldn't do it. And I also figured they might differ from one another in the sense that the Viking World by Simpson reads more like a general like coffee table book, whereas the Vikings book by Bronsted is more of like there's not a whole lot of pictures in it. It's, for perspective, it's like 400 pages. Whereas there's a fun receipt in the back of it. It cost, how many? It cost $2.50 to buy this back in 1975. I have the original receipt for it. Who knew? There you go. But yeah, I figured the two books probably would overlap. Maybe in a year from now, I'll come back and read the Vikings and then compare it to the Viking World. But just due to time constraints, I just couldn't feasibly do both of them. So that's pretty much what I have to say about the Vikings. It was a very short read, 192 pages, most of it pictures, and because of the ease of the writing style, I was able to just crank it out. Kristen would come over and she'd say, "Where'd you go?" And I was like, "Oh, I was on the back porch reading," and I just got caught up in it. So interesting, a lot of the stuff in this book. So I'd probably rate this. Do I think this is something that everyone should read? Absolutely not. I would say this is a solid 3 out of 5. A solid 3 out of 5 because, anything higher than that starts to get in the territory of like, this is a book that I think everyone should try to read at least once, but I don't think it reaches that level. But certainly you could do a lot worse with Viking books, and I think it's just so specific that maybe I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. But for someone who's generally vaguely interested, yeah, absolutely. See if you can't nab yourself an old copy of it. So with that being said, let's check out what other people are saying about it. So on Goodreads, there's not a whole lot. I was worried finding a book from 1980 about Viking archaeology, you sometimes don't end up with a lot of reviews for these things. But this one actually had a few written reviews. It had 8 ratings and 3 written reviews. It has a 4 out of 5 stars, like just 4.0 out of 5 stars. Rage, on July 29th, 2017, rated it 4 out of 5 stars and had this to say about it. This is a great introductory reference. The chapters are separated into different aspects of daily life, and there are lots of nice illustrations. Because this is an older book, I think we have more information now. I feel like in more recent works, I've seen authors treat Ibn Fadlan's, I don't know how to pronounce it, account with some hesitation. Was he sensationalizing? But this book uses his information often as a reliable source. Obviously, since I wasn't there, I can't say what the truth is. Still, this is a comprehensive overview and introduction to Viking life. And all the other written reviews seem to be generally positive. The lowest review it got was a 3 out of 5. There's only 2 of them. So, yeah, I certainly think that things have changed in the last 41 years. And I don't think you would be reading this to gather a lot of information on current and up-to-date stuff. But I think because a lot of Simpson's information is drawn from Icelandic sagas and a lot of folklore, which now makes sense knowing that she studied Icelandic folklore, I don't think there's really harm in reading this book. I don't think you're going to be like woefully misled, or that like there's going to be loads of stuff that's overturning our understanding of the Viking world. Certainly things have changed in our understanding, and there's a lot of nuance that's being missed 41 years on. But I think if you're just looking for general interesting facts about the Viking world, especially about Iceland, then I think this is a perfectly acceptable book to go check out. So yeah, that's the Viking World. 4 out of 5 from me. 4 out of 5 on Goodreads, 3 out of 5 from me. So I know this wasn't a very long episode, but that's also because I wanted to do some news and announcements here at the end. So the news and announcements mostly has to do with, as I was indicating, I couldn't read the Vikings and the Viking World just because I just didn't have enough time. As we start to move into summer and, COVID restrictions are changing, field season's starting to gear up and I'm out there in the field digging, it means a lot less time in the home office doing editing and recording episodes and having time to read. And so I think I was getting a bit overloaded. And so what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks is the next episode will be a season finale, so to speak. And I'm going to try and just do a season because 23 episodes seemed kind of appropriate. Or would that be 22? Because this is episode 21, I believe. Yeah. So 22 episodes in a season. And I'm going to take probably a month break. And I know that probably worries some of you. Hey, once you stop, it's hard to start again. And I disagree because I've really loved the momentum that I've had by recording this podcast. I have read more books in the first third of this year than probably I have in the last 4 years. Does that mean I haven't been reading? Absolutely not. I just think the quantity of reading that I've done has just been so enormous that it's really been hard to kind of enjoy the books and read them in a comfortable pace and not feel rushed. I definitely think in the case of the Viking World, I didn't feel rushed because it was so interesting, but there have been other books that I felt rushed to read. And so I'm going to take a month break, and in that month, I'm going to enjoy reading books and read them leisurely. That way I can build up a little bit of a backlog so that when I do start talking about episodes, I can spend a little bit more time when I'm going to record doing research on the authors or the topics or the subjects, or maybe I want to read a couple of books together. So in the case of Intro to Anthropology textbooks, that means if I have to read 10 anthropology textbooks, I have the time to read them all in a much more in-depth way than I would otherwise. So it's allowing me to, essentially I'm focusing more on quality over quantity here. Now, does that mean I'm just going to be vanishing? No. I'm still going to be posting things on my Patreon page, which is newly established. I'm probably going to be slowly working on transferring the book bin onto eBay. So that's another big thing that's going to be happening here as we come to a close to this season, is I'm going to be working on, eliminating or liquidating my book bin. So as you all know, probably at this point, there's a Google sheet that has all of the books that I've reviewed on the podcast that you can email me if you want to try and snag it on the book bin. Obviously, that has not generated a whole lot of movement, and I think probably that's my own lack of foresight to realize that people probably don't want to sort of swap books virtually and have me ship it to them. That just sounds odd enough. I don't know what my thinking was on that. I guess my thinking was the equivalent of people who put out, like, on their front yard, the little post that has all the books in it that says take a book, give a book kind of thing. And so instead, in order to help support the podcast, I created a web page that you can go check out on my Patreon. I've also linked it, at least I thought I linked it. I will link it on the show notes here. And you can go to the eBay page that I'm going to be creating to sell all the books on the book bin. And the goal is to take the proceeds to help improve production value on each of the episodes of the podcast. And it's also an opportunity for me to potentially buy new books. So replacing the books I'm purging from the library and adding new ones to the mix. So that's a great opportunity if any of the books that you've been interested in. For example, the Viking World will be one of them. I will be off on vacation for a week. So when this goes up, you guys will probably be able to see the eBay page and check out some of the books that I'm starting to throw up there, put up on the eBay page. But the Viking World will be one of them. So anything on the book bin on that Google sheet, in theory, will eventually be listed on eBay that you can buy yourself a copy of. And I'm still working on some other things, like uploading some artwork so then we can have some fun merch for the podcast. I've done some lithic illustrations recently that I'm trying to scan and then make into maybe like coffee mugs or something. I think it would be really fun to have a coffee mug with a lithic illustration of a projectile point, but maybe that's just me, as I literally have projectile points on my wall and an entire poster full of projectile points in chronology. And then I just recently updated some more from the earliest Americans. They had a fun projectile point typologies that I've thrown up on my wall as well. So yeah, I like lithic illustrations. So sue me. But those are some of the big updates that are going to be happening on the channel, or rather the podcast, not the channel. And I'll obviously still be uploading YouTube videos to my YouTube page as I get ready for the summer semester, because I'm in between the spring and the summer semesters. I'm going to start working on some educational content for my students. So I'll still be doing things. I just will be taking a month off from the podcast so that I can read books, focus on other things, and deliver quality content as opposed to quantity. And so those are the major updates that I wanted to mention here at the end of this episode. So next week's episode, which depends on scheduling availabilities of the guest that I'm bringing on, my guest Jack Trussler and I will be talking about Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. We will also be talking about The Paleolithic Prescription by Marjorie Shostak and two other doctors whose names are escaping me. Jack is currently borrowing the book, so I don't have it in front of me to know the titles. And we'll be talking about Fatland. So those are the three books. The theme is obviously diet books, and specifically the paleo diet. I have this book about the paleo diet, so I thought it'd be fun to talk about the paleo diet and talk about a book that is basically the vegetarian manifesto, Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals, and just comparing the two, because obviously one is, very well known in the public mindset as a very meat-friendly diet. The other one is very much a pro-vegetarianism book. And then Fatland is sort of in between the two of them. So I just kind of put all three of them together. So Jack and I will be talking about that in next week's episode. And until then, never stop reading. From the Archives is produced by Eric Olson, and its theme song is Lukewarm Hazy by Asher Filero.